Welcome to another edition of Ignite Agility. Welcome back, Josh Abrams.
Thank you.
We had so much content last time. I think we ran over on all the stuff you and I were geeking out in brain science that aligns with Scrum and Agility. We're like, we need a part two. So welcome to part two. We're going to talk about lecture versus facilitation because they are not the same thing. Agree?
Absolutely. Agreed. 100%. So we'll get started here. So when we talk about lecture versus facilitation, one of the things that we want to make sure is we understand the difference of the two. So lecture is a one-way communication. It is a head in a box. It's a person standing on stage or whoever's running your meeting just talking, which means everyone else is just listening. So it's passive learning, and that's really not the best way to learn. It's leader controlled, which is why people tend to default to it because it gives you control, right? If you're the leader, you got to be in control, you got to drive it. And it allows for a quick delivery of information. There are good things about a lecture. The trick is how do you switch from lecture to facilitation, which fosters two-way communication, active learning, allows the participants to be involved so they can help drive or fill in the gaps. And it really does increase that retention, because there's going to be things that everybody kind of latches onto, or they're able to take what you're saying and kind of paraphrase it in their own language, which may also help the group, right? Because you want to speak in the language of the group.
So I
So when
didn't hear you say lecture bad. That's not what I heard you say. I didn't hear you say lecture's bad. I heard you say, hey, this can actually be helpful. These are just different things.
Right. Lecture is not a bad thing as long as it's not what you're doing the whole time. Like the tools in your toolbox, you don't want to just use the same tool all the time where another tool might be better. And sometimes it's a give and take. Sometimes you have to pull back. So let's say you're time boxed in your 15 minutes and you kick it off with lecture, right? This is what we're doing. This is why we're here. Here's what we need to accomplish. Then how do you transition into facilitation without running over that time, or how much can you give or take? It's really getting the group involved and then being able to kind of pull back in a way that doesn't shut them down. So lecture's great for one-way communication, being in control, or if you just got to get a quick hit of information, lecture's great for that. But if that's all you're ever doing, and then you're surprised why people don't remember your meetings, or nobody wants to go, or they don't remember anything. They didn't remember that one part.
I think I told you my recent horror story. I make a horrible student, 2-hour meeting, talk the facilitator. I'm using air quotes intentionally because they weren't facilitating. They talked for 90 minutes straight and then let us as participants get involved.
So through that, like, how much struggle did you have staying focused, for that full time period?
A lot, because I'm used to all this brain science stuff that, you talk about, which gets me excited. So I started doodling and I started making little notes like, here's what you could have done here. Here's what you could have done here. So I'm just going to make a horrible student in that regard.
So, so on that, one way that we can check in, and it makes it harder with digital tools, is body language.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in my class and I think I'm facilitating, but everybody's doodling, then that's a check on me to say, oh, hey, wait a minute. Have I just fallen into lecture? Did I get on my soapbox and I haven't been talking for 10 minutes and I've tuned everybody out? So, we really need to kind of check in on that body language. It gets difficult though in a Zoom call, or when you have 30 heads in a box, to go back and forth and try to do that, which is a lot of times why we want to use a co-pilot or have somebody there helping kind of facilitate the meeting that we're doing, so they can check in or keep the chats rolling. And hopefully that doesn't become too distracted where you have like two different conversations going on. So it really is a dance. It's hard enough to do it in person, and then as you add all this technology, it just makes it that much more constraining, because 80% of the input that we take in visually, or 80% of the input that we take in, is visual. If you think about when you're watching people's lips move, that's your brain kind of interpreting the things that they're saying. When you look at their posture, that speaks volumes. And so when you're lecturing, you don't care about any of that. You're just up there, you're talking for your 50-minute block, and then you're getting off the stage and you're going about your day. But when you're trying to facilitate, you really want to make sure everyone is actively involved to the best of their ability. And some people will never be, some people just don't want to put themselves out there. And so creating a space for them too can be somewhat interesting. So if you think about all of the 15-minute, huddles or scrums that you've done, how does this kind of align with that?
Yeah, for the virtual tools, I think that for those people who are shy about being on camera, something like Zoom has a little thumbs up, right? A little electronic thumbs up or a little electronic hands up. But ideally, because of the 80% rule, they turn on their camera. And so one of the things I invite people to do is use their real thumbs, because not only do they have these, it's so much faster than everybody fishing for the electronic tools, or just raise your hand virtually, or your real hand. You don't need to find the little electronic hand, because it goes so much faster. So for a 15-minute or less, daily scrum, can we respect each other, which is a scrum value, respect, right? Can we respect each other enough to just turn our cameras on? And that'll make this short and sweet, talking about, are we on track? Or are we not on track for the sprint goal? Right? Or do we have questions, or do we have to hang out after, or whatnot? So yeah, there's lots of ways, I think, even if we are constrained by a tool like Zoom or Microsoft Teams is kind of popular with a lot of people. If we can just get that camera going for 15 minutes or less, and if not, there's still ways to show some of the things on your picture here, to interact with each other, even if we don't have the camera on.
Because I mean, if what's one of these figurines that just jumps out at you? Which one of these is just your eye drawn to?
Well, the one that my eye was drawn to, and this may be a bad example though, was this one, because we have somebody on our team who is from London, and this means something very different.
That's a perfect example, because what does that say to you?
Right. That just made me laugh, because it's like, oh, he's giving me the bird,
Right.
in a different language.
Right. So and that it's perfect, right? Because there could be cultural constraints, different things mean something to different people, and our brain fills in the gap. And that's one of the crazy things about the human brain, is that it seeks information and it wants the most information it can have. And sometimes it makes it up. The old saying about assumptions. But why is that
Mm-hmm.
still relevant as much today as it was anywhere else? Because our brain wants to know. It's got to know what's going on, and it can be uncomfortable to figure out, or have that conversation. And so that really leads into checking in, right? You cannot 100% be sure that the way that you're reading that is the way they intend it. And so you have to be aware, just not about your own body language, but about somebody else's body language. Speaking of Zoom, I will generally turn my camera off on a lot of calls if there's a lot of people in there. And if they ask me something, I will come back on camera,
Mm-hmm.
do my
Nice.
piece, and then get back off camera. And most of that's because I'm fidgety. And I don't want them to interpret that fidgety motion that I have from sitting there and taking it in as I'm bored or I'm checked out, when that's not really what's going on. Or a lot of times I'm staring down and I'm taking notes. I like to take notes by hand. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
want them to just be scrolling through faces in a box and see me looking down and think I'm disengaged or typing an email or something. So to make it easy, to make sure I'm communicating the message I want, I just come off camera. And then when they ask me a question, I'll just pop it back on. But I mean, if you look at these two figurines, what's the story telling you?
Somebody is not necessarily buying what the other person is selling. Looks like they're that's the way I take it anyway. Because their foot's even raised, like they're
Mm-hmm.
impatient, like they're tap, tap, tap.
So in classes where we talk about this and somebody's telling the story, they sometimes miss the foot. And when you say, "Hey, well, what about his foot down there?" Like, "Oh, that totally changes the whole story for me," right? But at the end of the day, I don't really know what's going on, and we have to accept that. So we have to make the uncomfortable choice sometimes and ask people, "Hey, what's going on?" And that's a scary thing to do. So a lot of people, and I see this all the time in small group dynamics, they they are afraid to ask, "Hey, what's going on?" Right? Because they don't want to be intrusive or whatever their reason, but it's the right thing to do, right? Because if I think that you feel a certain way and I don't check in and then I do a bunch of stuff and then it's not the thing that's going to make you feel better, what typically ends up happening?
The brain fills in the story. I'm going to make something up
Yeah.
about that situation.
And so let's say you're upset and I think you're upset for a particular reason. I don't check in. So I go and I do something, but it's not the thing that's going to make you feel better. Then it could end up making you feel worse or angry, or, maybe you just need to be left alone. It's definitely something that's difficult to do. And the more you're invested emotionally with people, the harder it gets to do. And that's totally a weird thing about social interaction. Um, and I've experienced it every time I move to a new job. I'm the new guy on the block. I've got no street cred. I don't know how your business works or anything, but I mean, 5 seconds into a conversation in a small group, they're giving me all the dirty laundry stuff they won't even tell their manager. And it's like, why are you telling a complete stranger this stuff? All of
Because
these great insights, right? Go ahead.
right, because it's safe.
Because it's safe. They don't know me,
You're
and
neutral.
I'm neutral, right? So how do you maintain that neutrality? But we check in. If somebody's uncomfortable, I say, hey, what about this makes you uncomfortable? If they share, great. If they don't share, great. But then I know I don't have to do anything about it. And that's a big part of facilitation, is keeping that, warm and fuzzy kind of going across the group.
Do you think context is important? For example, I think of like a 2 day certified Scrum Master class, like you came through. One of the things I tell people is, okay, for the cameras, yeah, this is going to enable us to participate, but we're going to employ a lot of common sense, because there's people who've had unfortunate situations, or for virtual meetings, they've been told they have to be like this the entire time. Because you mentioned fidgeting, it's like, so I tell people, if you want to swivel in your chair, swivel in your chair. You want to give yourself a little stretch, you give yourself a little stretch. If you're going to be taking notes, which I encourage, and I see you doing this, I'm not going to assume the worst about you. I'm going to assume you're writing down the last thing that got said, so a lot of common sense. And then of course, a lot of breaks, of like we talked about in the last segment. But so do you think that context plays into it, whether it's, a meeting with the boss online versus a meeting with your team online, or a training class or something like that?
Me personally, I feel like context is everything, because it adds information, like the situation in which you set yourself up in. If I try to go to a noisy production environment and have a huddle, I'm going to have way less success than if I have it off the floor in a small team room. If I have tools, I recently just went through a training where, I bring candy. It's one of the things to do. What they don't know is I'm fueling their frontal lobe for attention, but I'm bringing candy, so I'm the candy guy. And it was like, when on the third day of the training, they came in and they were super jazzed, and they're like, we just wanted to see what you brought us today. So, you know,
Bribes. So bribes work.
I love to bribe, candy. It's the way to do it. But yeah, especially for those folks with ADHD, the candy, that sugar bump helps them kind of reapply a little bit of focus, right? Because ADD is an executive function issue. You know exactly what you need to do, but on the steps into doing it, somehow you lose your way or you get distracted, the squirrel moment, right? So candy kind
Hmm.
of helps bring that back around a little bit, that little sugar bump. So when we transition to instructional strategies, you have something from total instructor control all the way to total learner control. Now, for a classroom, where you have a much larger time box and things, typically you can prepare a little bit better for, because things aren't new. It's new for the learner, but it's not exactly new for the instructor. You start with lecture, because that gives you control. You set your rules, you set your expectations, you kind of lay the groundwork. But then you can open it up to group discussion. You can do a case study, you can role play, you can put them on self-directed learning for homework. You can have activities or simulations, and I'm huge into activities.
Hmm.
And then you can even set up some self-learning groups. So in this pathway, you allow the learners or the participants to gain control, so they can start directing their learners. Going back to adults, right? We all have developed ways to learn outside of the classroom, right? At some point you get off an educational framework, either it's high school or college or something, and you have to figure out how to do things yourself. Today it's a little bit more easy, because I can ask the simple question of, how do you learn stuff? Like, I go to YouTube. So
Right. Yeah. I'm a visual learner. I need
yeah.
videos.
So when you do that, right, and you bring people back into a structured kind of learning or group activity, they have different strategies that they have employed to be successful. And so then they have to kind of break those habits in those learning groups. whether it be group discussion or whether you're doing a role play. But again, they're not going to do it during a lecture if that's all you do. And so the trick, at least from the huddles that I've done and the things that I've worked on, is to how to get off lecture as quick as possible. It's super easy to do if it's something you've taught 100 times because you have experience and feedback. So for example, you start with a lecture, you have a quick group discussion, and maybe from that discussion, that you just need to jump into some self-directed learning. And then it might culminate with some activities or maybe a simulation, right? But a lot of times in Scrum, because everything is new, you don't know which way it's going to go, and you're very limited in your time. So understanding that you have to kick it off, but you have to let the group participate will help kind of drive where those strategies are, right? If you're aware that they're even there. So on that, through huddles that you've done, how do you feel this kind of plays?
Yeah, it aligns with the most powerful way that we want to see a daily scrum. According to the new guide, the developers conduct their own daily scrum. So as a scrum master, your role is really teaching them the intent and ensuring that it's happening. So ideally, once you've done your part, teaching them what that's all about, they can even kick it off, right? One of them starts talking about what they did towards a sprint goal, and then throwing the ball is what our team calls it, right? Throwing the ball to Josh, right? So kind of virtually throwing somebody the ball. So they're kind of self facilitating by calling on each other. If you're not even there as the scrum master, what if you call in sick? What if you're on vacation? Are we saying, oh, daily scrum is canceled? Well, no, if you've taught them well and they understand how they can self conduct or self facilitate this, then you may not even, be needed in that sense because they've understood, the intent of the event and they have no problem carrying it out. So they get right down to the activity, right?
Absolutely. And for me, lecture typically is, why we're here, what's in it for us, and that takes care of the two biggest things that adults need to focus. What is the goal that we're trying to accomplish? And then I kick it to the group. And it really depends on where I'm the subject matter expert. A lot of times, since I'm developing training that isn't focused on training, I have to kick it to subject matter experts. I try to put as many subject matter experts as I can together on a group or on a team. And then I say, to align with instructional strategies, this is where we need to be. So how do we go from where you are to here? You all tell me. And they're blown away. They're like, wait, you're supposed to be the guy who's going to fix all this. And I was like, I'm going to fix all this, but I'm not the guy who's going to tell you how to do your job.
That's where you got to give them the old Jerry Maguire speech, right? It's like, help me help you. It's
Right.
like, I'm going to help you help yourself. That's why I'm here.
I mean, if I had a magic wand and could come in and just, cast a spell and fix everything, that'd be great. But, we're limited on time, we're limited on money, and I just don't have that kind of magic. So, I think, once they get over the initial shock of that, but by making them a part of it, that's new. That always amazes me how much that is missed. I think by a lot of senior leadership is how much is just thrown at these people as opposed to involving them before you've made a decision.
Right.
And, everything I get from the bottom level is always, well, nobody told me about this and they just threw this at us and we don't even know what we're supposed to do. And then when I give that feedback to upper management, they're like, well, nobody told me what I was supposed to do. So it's just such a bad game of telephone where people from such high levels in organization are throwing things down at these people and then they're totally stuck. But yet at that level, that's where you got to figure it out. So, these are the tools or the things that I have found that even outside of training, just putting together teams kind of helps make this successful. It's, how do we get to where we want to be? How do we get the group involved as much as we can? And then what is it on this pathway do we need to be successful? Because if you think about a Scrum team, I mean, they're self-directed learners. They are self-learning groups. They're going to figure it out. That's why you put them together. And then maybe you have to go back and forth. This is not a one-way street. You can slide up, you can slide back down. Generally, the start and the close will be a lecture. Everything else, I try to have it make sense for what we're to get the message across, because that's the learning in Scrum for me. It's like, how do we get everybody to visualize the same thing? which can be extremely difficult.
Right. And there's two parts in that, because one is the subject matter expertise of what they're building, whether it's software, whether it's a product, the work. But then the other aspect of it is you've been asked to work an entirely different way. So it's like a bad Dilbert cartoon, what you were talking about before, when the leaders are like, we're going agile, just start sprinting. Oh yeah, by the way, that was your training. And then the poor developers are like, what am I supposed to do? Right. I knew what to do in the old way, but in this new way, I'm kind of stuck. So one of the most powerful things I think you can do too is give them the free Scrum guide and let them just read it, and then if they read it for themselves, and as the instructor or facilitator saying, okay, what surprised you about that? Did you learn something different that you didn't know before? Yeah, I assumed that the daily scrum was a status report to you. I didn't know it's all about us talking to each other. Well, welcome to the conversation.
And you make a good point there too. When they do that, the group that I'm working with right now, they decided to go Scrum because they weren't having success with Lean Six Sigma, because there's so much change in the organization. From the manufacturing piece, that really hasn't changed for this group in about 20 or 30 years. I mean, some of these machines are very old, but there's just nothing better it's doing the good work. And there's a wall of green belts and black belts. And so they were having little success at this point because the new problem is the people. The people are changing. A lot of the people that built these facilities have retired, and they took all that knowledge with them and they forgot to write it down. I bet you've never heard that before.
Never.
So they had to come up with something new, and however they landed into Scrum, they did just that. They downloaded the guide online. They're like, well, we're all green belts. We should be able to figure out Agile. It's Agile, right? And they did a really good job. But when I came on, they were like, we did the best we could. And they were really down on themselves. They were like, I'm sure it doesn't align, or I'm sure it's this, or I'm sure it's that. It was all negatives. And then I looked at it and I was like, you guys are 90% of the way there. For just reading the guide and giving it your best shot,
Yeah.
you were 90% of the way there. But they didn't have somebody who could help them understand that. And they had great successes, but then the successes would quickly relapse. People would fall back on, the bad habits that got them in trouble in the first place. So when they would put the Scrum group together and management was there, they would do really well. But then in a couple of weeks, they'd see all those gains fall away. And that's, when I saw that kind of ebb and flow on the data, that's when I started asking, well, who is your developer? It's like all these people. Okay, who's your Scrum master? We didn't designate one. Who's your product owner? Well, we think it's this person. So very quickly, it's like, when there's structure, it worked and it's great, but this isn't a one and done kind of thing. Understanding that all of this is something that needs to be managed, that needs to be cared for.
Continuous improvement.
Continuous improvement. Somebody has to manage it. So to me, I wouldn't start a Scrum until I had those. That's the first thing you would do, right? Is designate who's doing what before you start doing.
And I love that the new guide calls them accountabilities. You can call a role whatever the heck you want.
Sure.
Because in the new guide, they say it's referred to not as a role, it's referred to as an accountability. So when you saying, who's your Scrum master or who's your product owner, that's fine. If they're like, well, we think it's this person, as long as that person, regardless of whether you call them senior vice president of very important things, as long as they're doing these things and this is what they're accountable for, boom, we don't care what you call it on paper, right? What the role is actually called. Exactly. A lot of people miss that.
And I almost think that they were afraid. I think they were just afraid to assign it because they didn't know truly what that person's responsible for.
Okay.
And going back to in their particular case, with the amount of turnover that they've had, they're all already doing 2 or 3 jobs. And I feel bad for them for that. That you never want to see that, right? Because it really pulls that focus. It's really the anti-Scrum, right? Because you're supposed to have dedicated teams working on one thing. Well, before you even get to the Scrum, if somebody's doing 3 jobs, it makes it very hard for them to absorb anything else because they're already overtasked.
Yeah. If they're looking to get any sort of sanity to that situation, if the situation is what it is, I'll say, just look at the work but now you've got to order it. Something has to be 1, something has to be 2, something has to be 3, all that stuff can't be dumped on them. And they can't be told, hey, it's all priority, because then nothing is. And then they're whipsawed a little bit every time somebody screams at them.
Right. And you're right back where you started, where there's no strategy. Um, everybody really has to, like with instructional strategies, you have to know where you're going before you employ a strategy. And if you don't, I think that's why everybody defaults to lecture and then never gets out of there, because it's a little scary. It's a little bit scary to give away that control if you're the person who's responsible. But if
Yeah.
you
And
go
what's
ahead.
the worst? I don't know why it's so scary, because what's the worst that could happen?
Right. You can just take it right back as long as you have a catchphrase that everybody knows. And I get called out at, like, people, like, whenever you take something back, you always say, hey, let's go back a couple steps, or hey, let's go back to the beginning. Or, it's very kind of what I try to do as a neutral. But I had a trainer call me out at one time. He's like, oh, I always know when it's gotten too far off the beaten path, because you say, hey, let's take it back a couple steps. Let's go back to this one point. And he was like, sometimes I'm just waiting for it. It's like, have I become that, routine, I guess?
Predictable.
Yeah. Well, it is what it is. You know, so given these two things, from the facilitation standpoint, um, you know, the body language, the checking in, lecture versus facilitation, what really stands out for you that could really, like, where could this really help?
I think can really help in terms of not being afraid to give it to them. Because I think that people do start off lecturing, but even then, if they're like, oh, I've got all this stuff I want them to learn, it's like, learning isn't the instructor's job, it's the student's job. And the only way they're going to do that is if you give that control to them. So, all kinds of things that you have on the slide here, it's not any one thing. How easy would it be to say, go have a quick group discussion about that and come back? How easy would it be to say, here's a case study that you all can go read and then report back out as a team in terms of what your findings were? We're big on role play in the workshops that we do around here, just because you went through one. Day 2, it's kind of like we immerse you into a bit of a contrived situation, but I still think it's better to let people fail fast. It's better to let people role play when the stakes are what I call lower than when the stakes are higher and you're asked to perform in the moment, for real, air quotes there, for real. Okay, could they use that learning opportunity to its maximum advantage by role playing the scenarios? Because so what if you fail in the training class exercise? I bet you learned something from that first attempt in learning.
Yeah, and really, you don't. I mean, you don't have to solve everything in every meeting.
Mm-mm.
Right. You just need to keep the ball going downfield. Just even today, I reached out to somebody and they really wanted this other person on the conversation. And I looked at their calendar and they're not going to be available for 3 weeks. It's more important to have the conversation this week than it is to wait 3 weeks, because I can do a lot. Just with a little bit of information, I can do a lot in between there. So as long as you just keep moving the ball a little bit every day, you'll get there. And I think that goes back to, if you look at iterative design and the things around that, everybody's looking for the one right answer, because that's how we're taught in college, right? There's one right answer to this test. There's one right way to do things. We get institutionalized to that, and we have to kind of reevaluate what college or even K through 12 is trying to teach us. Um, their definition of done is definitely not in the real world. Nobody cares what you do with your, and I mean that in the most genuine way. A college professor isn't going to see how you use what you did after you leave the
Right.
classroom. That's not what they need to be successful. The grade that you get and that survey that you give at the end of your college course, that's their definition of done.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
how successful you are after you leave that classroom has no impact on whether or not that college professor keeps their job or not.
True. And with all this virtual stuff that everybody has been thrown into, and I admit, even when, the Scrum Alliance rocked everybody's world in our community and said, yeah, I know we told you it had to be in person, but now take it all online. A couple people, panicked like me. And how do we do that? And now a couple years into it, it's like, it does not need to be all or nothing. With some of the advanced stuff, you've got self-learning groups on there, you've got self-directed learning on there. We've started to get real creative with, here's a little worksheet. I'm going to let you go right now. Just go ahead and log off. I'm going to let you go ahead and go take care of that. Come at the start of tomorrow with all that ready. But it gives them time back at the end of their day, which they're usually pleasantly surprised by or relieved by, or a bit of both. But there's so many people who don't necessarily perform well if they're put on the spot. Have you heard that before, where people say, I need time to think? I'm one of those people who needs time to think, or introverts who prefer to just jot a few things down before getting into a situation with other learners. So we've really started to take advantage of a lot of those kinds of things in the virtual realm, because it's definitely not going away.
No, and it's one of those things, I think, and this may be a little off topic, but the learning doesn't change. Like when people say, oh, well, that's not the same because it's a different product. The product really doesn't matter.
Right.
People are the same, and people are always going to learn kind of the same way. You have to be focused. You have to be invested. You have to know what the benefits and the negatives are for participating. If you said you're going to send me to a training, but you don't care if I go and I'm going to get paid either way, unless I'm intrinsically motivated to go to that training, who knows what's going to happen. So, that's the funny thing about dealing with adults. They have to know what's in it for them. They
Right.
have to know why they're doing something, or it's just a struggle to focus, right? Because I think over time our brain filters just get more restrictive. We're not as open to things unless there's something we're interested in. The plus side is that if you can kind of meet them in the middle, right, and you can get them those things up front, and you can hit it in that lecture, you can then play with this however you want, and it's gonna change based on the topic. It's gonna change based on the product. It's gonna change based on your team, and the better you get to learn your team, the better you can do in those limited time boxes. There are people who I absolutely, after working with for a few years, would just say, hey, I just need you to go research something for me and just bring me back whatever you find. It was a 5-second conversation, but they don't
Right.
want to talk about it. They just want to go and do good research. They're good researchers. And then other people, if I did that, they would be like, oh, I got distracted, or this came up or that came up. So for them, I've got to kind of paint them a picture. We've got to discuss it. They have to ask a bunch of questions. And through that, we can kind of come to the consensus. Then they go off and do great things. And so really understanding who benefits for what and where can also help in those limited timelines, because I also don't see us getting a lot more time to do things.
No, everything that I always give people that deep thought, right? I always say, it's not that you didn't have enough time, it's what you chose to do with the time I gave you. And then they say, thanks, Yoda, right? Real helpful.
Right.
It's
But
like the time box is the time box.
it's one of those things where I think that we want to give good answers. We want to have all the answers. And sometimes it's scary to say, I'm going to need some time to look at that. I'm going to need some time to see what I can do. I recently overheard a conversation with an intern and a manager at work, and the manager was asking for a ton of stuff, and they just kept nodding their head up and down. Never asked a single question. And so I took that
Yikes.
intern off to the side and I said, do you know how to do a needs analysis? And he's like, I don't even know what that is. It's like, welcome to my world. So we sat down and I said, look, you're a software developer. You develop, bits and pieces of code, and you do this, you do that. You were the subject matter expert, and you were in great demand. So you're going to have a career of people asking you to do all kinds of stuff that they don't understand because they're not software developers, but they know that you have a magic wand, right? You can get into Power BI or Excel and you can do all kinds of crazy things. So that's good. So make sure you have a clear definition of done, right, that you both agree on before you agree to do anything else. That'll keep you safe and it'll keep expectations aligned. But he's an intern. He's never been shown that before. He's still got a year of college
Right.
left. And I don't
Right?
think they really cover that in software development.
They don't teach you how to talk to people. No.
No.
Let's get right to the zeros and ones. Let's get right to the coding. So if we were to put a bow on this, if we were to wrap this one up, this lecture versus facilitation, what are the takeaways that we're hoping people got from it? Knowing that we can ask them questions right now, we'd love to, but we're recording this and throwing it out there.
Right. So don't be afraid to give up control. You have a group of highly motivated individuals that you've put together who are very smart in what they do. Let them be smart in what they do. That's why they're there. Use that power of the group. But I go back to force multiplication all the time. Me working on one thing is a 1 times force application, but if I can bring 4 people along, that's a 5 times force application. You can do a lot more and a lot less, and it can be more successful. Play
Take
with
take it to the team. When in doubt, take it to the team.
right, because it's a team effort. Definitely check in. And I know it's scary. That's probably one of the scariest things to do because you don't know what the answer is going to be. If somebody's having a bad day, right, you can read the big body language, right? They're upset, they're frustrated. Don't guess at what they're frustrated at. Just ask them, hey, are you feeling okay? One of the things that always amazed me from having kids was that when they first started to be able to talk, our conversations were very limited. They would be upset, and I would ask them basically one of 2 questions. Are you hungry? Are you tired? What I didn't catch myself doing was doing it with adults. And I caught myself doing it with adults. And what surprised me was that how often it was one of those 2 things.
Right.
Somebody at work would be having a really bad day, and you just like, hey, what's wrong? And I don't want to talk about it. It's like, okay, fine, you leave it alone. Hey, what's wrong? I just had a really bad night. Were you hungry? You tired? Oh, the dog kept me up all night, so I didn't get any sleep. Yeah, I skipped breakfast. I was like, we should probably eat something. And then, and you'd be amazed in 20 minutes, they're kind of almost back to their normal selves, just a little more tired. So checking in, even at a base level, making that connection can really go a long way.
Nice.
And play with this, right? You might have to start with a lecture, you might have to end with a lecture, but yeah, kick it to the group as fast as you can, get them involved. That really helps with that buy-in. And in my personal opinion, 4 people are always going to be way smarter than me. So let them. Don't get in their way.
Yeah, we like to say none of us is as smart as all of us around
No.
here. That's kind of our little thing around here. Well, Josh, thanks so much for sharing more on working with adults in today's lecture versus facilitation.
Thank you.
I'm going to go. And we're clear.